Hi class, this is a presentation on literary elements, analyzing literature using the type of critical theory called new criticism or formalism. And for this module, this learning module, this unit, we're going to look at how we analyze literature. And our first slideshow will be on literary elements, and our next one after this will be on literary theories, or sometimes called critical lenses. Let's start with literary elements. First of all, when you are looking at literature, literary works, and that is fiction. Fiction is not true. Fiction is made up stories, poems, plays. Documentaries are not fiction. Um, Movies are fiction. TV shows that aren't reality shows that are made up are fiction. When you look at fiction, and when we do this in literature, we want to analyze and not summarize. A summary merely recounts the events of the story in shorter form. It just tells us what happens. That's like when you go to a movie and you come home and you tell your roommate or friend or whatever, you say, I just saw the greatest movie. Here's what happened. First of all, this happened, and this happened. So you're telling us in chronological order what happened. So that's not analysis. Analysis of anything breaks something down into its component parts. So, for example, when you're sick, you go to the doctor. You say, well, doctor, I don't feel well. That's your summary. What does the doctor do? Well, he looks at the different parts of you. He takes your temperature. He looks up your nose with his little instrument and your ears and puts his tongue depressor on you. He takes your blood pressure. If it's really bad, he gives you an x-ray or an MRI. He's looking at the parts of you to figure out what's going on with you. Same thing happens when, say, your car doesn't work. Take it to the car mechanic and he looks at the different parts to figure out what's going on. Well, we do the same thing in literature. We look at the parts of the story, and the parts are the literary elements, to figure out what's happening, what the theme is, what the author's message is. We're analyzing. So all of these literary elements work together to show the theme. The theme is what we're trying to uncover when we read a story. The theme is the author's ideas. Now, there's the basic idea, which is just almost one word, death or hope or something like that. And there's the more specific theme. That's what we want to find, the more specific thing. For example, John Donne wrote a poem, Death Be Not Proud, and Dylan Thomas wrote Do Not Go Gentle into That Good Night. Both of them have the theme of death. They're talking about death and dying. Dylan Thomas is saying, rage, rage against the dying of the night. Fight death with all your might is what he wants you to do. Death is inevitable, but we have to fight it. We have to live life to the fullest while we're here. John Donne says, death be not proud, though some have called thee so. In other words, he's saying, we've already, won the whole death thing, because when we die, we get resurrected, and death then dies. So his attitude towards death is, superior. Death will, lose in the end. And Dylan Thomas is fight death. Very different ideas when you get down to the specifics of their attitude towards death. So that's what we want to look at, the author's statement about the ideas, the story's message, main point. And then how do you feel when you read the story? What are you getting out of it? Because that's giving you some clue as to the theme. One of the first places to start, one of the most important literary elements, is conflict. All stories have a conflict. Stories would be novels, short stories, movies, fiction, sitcoms, or drama, TV shows. Um, these are stories. Um, Poems don't necessarily have a conflict. Some of them might, but they all have a conflict, and this is one of the best ways to find a theme. It's something versus something else, two forces working against each other. And in high school, you might have heard man versus man, man versus nature, man versus himself. But we want to get more specific. What are the particular forces in the story that are working against each other? What two particular people are, opposing each other? What forces do they represent? What ideas or interests or values are opposing each other? Institutions. Um, what decisions are the characters making? Between what and what are they deciding? And what do these things represent? That's your conflict. All stories have to have a conflict. And the story is about resolving the conflict. And in fact, once that conflict is resolved, the story is over. Um, so they all revolve around that conflict. For example, if you were to go to a movie and plunk down your $10 and go in and to watch that movie, and it's something like boy meets girl, girl meets boy, boy falls in love with girl, girl falls in love with boy, and they live happily ever after, you'd want your $10 back because nothing happened. There's no conflict. But if you went to that same movie, but it was a different one, paid you $10, boy meets girl, girl meets boy, boy falls in love with girl, girl is married to boy's half-brother who killed boy's father and stole the inheritance and is telling girl that boy did it. Well, you got your money's worth for that story. The whole story would be about resolving that conflict and the boy achieving his goals. So that's how stories work. Characterization is another big literary element in stories. The kind of people, what kind of people are they? Look at what their beliefs are, their hopes, their dreams, their ideals. What values and morals do they have? What are their fears? What are their strengths and weaknesses, their vices and virtues? What are their talents? Look at how they act. Look at what they say and do to reveal themselves. If it's omniscient, you can ask, what are they thinking that reveal who they are? What do others say and do about them? What are your feelings about them? Some kinds of characters include round characters or flat characters. Round characters are many-sided. They're both good and bad. They're like real people. In real life, you don't have all good people or all bad people. Flat characters just have one side. They really serve to move the plot forward. Dynamic characters are usually round, but it means something different. Dynamic characters change in the course of the story. Often it's the protagonist, the main character, who, at the crisis and climax of the story, has a realization, learns a lesson. Dynamic characters are headed on one path and have a realization and learn a lesson. That's how we, the reader, learn from the stories, through the character. Static characters don't change. They stay the same throughout. Protagonists is usually the main character, not always, but they are the guy or the girl that we identify with, that we root for, that we want to win. They don't necessarily have to be the good guy, because sometimes, like Bonnie and Clyde, Thelma and Louise, Bonnie and Clyde were bank robbers. Thelma and Louise killed a guy. They were running from the police. But we still wanted them to win. So protagonists are the people that we are identifying with and want to win, usually the main character. Antagonist you can think of as anti-protagonist, and they are working against the main character. They're the ones preventing the main character from achieving his or her goal. Foils, they're often friends of the protagonist, but they have opposite personality characteristics, and their difference serves to highlight the characteristics of the protagonist. So, symbolism. Symbolism is what concrete, specific objects have been used to represent abstract ideas. These are colors, names, settings, recurring objects. These are often symbols. What do they represent? Concrete means tangible. It means tangible means touchable. It means something you can perceive with your five senses: sight, sound, taste, touch, smell. Abstract is something that you cannot perceive with your five senses, so that it doesn't exist in the physical world. And these are things like feelings or ideas. So a symbol is some tangible object that represents something abstract. So here's a picture of some signs and symbols. A sign is a physical object that represents something else physical, something in the real world, the tangible world. A symbol is a physical object that represents something not in the tangible world, something abstract. So on our left, we have a picture of a printer icon. Like if you're printing a Word document, you press that icon to print your document. And then we have the universal stop sign, the circle with a line through it means no, don't go in here, the opposite of it, don't do this. And then we have some stoplights, green, red. Green means go, red means stop. These are all physical items. We can see them, we can touch them. And they represent physical actions. So these are signs. But symbols are physical objects that represent something abstract, feelings or ideas. So if we look at our dove, a white dove with an olive branch, we can see it, we can perceive it with our senses, but it represents peace. So peace is an idea. Peace is, you can't touch peace. Same with our cross. Cross is pretty universal across literature, and you can see a crucifix in a church, or you can see a picture of it like right here, and you can read about it in your story, but it's representing something abstract. It represents salvation or redemption or Christianity. And these things you can't touch. So the dove, the white dove and the cross are universal symbols. Contextual symbols would be symbols that only have their symbolic meaning within the story you're reading. Like if we read Charlotte Perkins Gilman, The Yellow Wallpaper. The yellow wallpaper represents our narrator's deteriorating mind, and personally and sociologically is representing, how women are trapped and imprisoned. But that meaning only has meaning in that story. In any other story, if you saw a yellow wallpaper, it wouldn't mean that. So that's a contextual symbol. So symbols can be both universal and contextual. So setting is time and place. And setting is also symbolic most of the time, actually. So time, what century does it take place in? What year? Is it the 1800s in the Old West? Is it the 21st century on a planet far, far away? Time of day also could be symbolic. For example, morning represents birth, rebirth, youth, because things are growing, it's fertile. Midday represents midlife, and then the end of the day, of course, is the end of life, death. Um, the same with the year. Spring is birth and rebirth, and summer is the productivity of adulthood, and fall is reaping the rewards of that, but also going into winter, which is death. Death of the year because things die, and it's dark and wintry and everything else. Place. Um, so where does it take place? And then the surroundings, environment could be symbolic. For example, a dark and stormy night never foretells good things happening. Um, Certain things can be symbolic, like trees can be symbolic, water can be symbolic. Um, Atmospheres, the feelings evoked by setting. You won't use that a lot, but I just want you to know that term. The same with tone. Tone is the emotional feeling of the work as a whole. You won't really use that a lot in your writing to determine theme. But is it sarcastic? Is it happy? Is it sad? Is it angry? Whatever. Diction is the language that's used. What's the sentence structure? Is it short and choppy? Is it long and flowing? What's the word choice? The author can convey meaning through diction. Figurative language is using language non-literally. So usually it would have a couple of meanings, two meanings, sometimes the figurative meaning and then the real meaning, the literal meaning. And the most famous that you probably know is a metaphor, a direct comparison. My love is a rose, he was a snake. So for example, rose is red, which is passionate. It is soft and sweet, and it smells good and beautiful, but it has thorns in it, like love can be. Snakes are kind of slithery and slimy and kind of sneaky and dangerous, we think. They crawl on the ground. And so if he's like that, then we find out more about his characteristics through that metaphor. Simile does exactly the same thing. It's just indirect. It's mediated by like or as. My love is like a rose, or he was as mean as a snake. So here's some more figurative language examples. A simile metaphor example. Personification is giving human attributes to non-human entities. Allusion is Allusion, referring to real or fictitious people, places, events in common culture. In this example, she proofread her essay again and again, searching for errors with the tenacity of Captain Ahab. Captain Ahab is a character in a book in Western culture called Moby Dick, and he searched obsessively for the white whale. And so now we know that she's proofreading her essay obsessively, if we're familiar with that story from this comparison. Hyperbole is an exaggeration, it's an overstatement. For example, the cockroaches in my kitchen had now grown to the size of carry-on luggage. Well, we know they actually weren't that size. We're just saying they're pretty big. We're exaggerating to get the message across. Understatement's the opposite. And synecdoche, Synecdoche, is a part of something used to represent the whole. In this case, 100 tired feet hit the dance floor for one last jitterbug. The feet represent the dancers. We know it wasn't just the feet. We know it was the dancers as well. Plot structure. A lot of people have elaborated in detail on plot structure. There's 5 basic elements for you to be concerned about: exposition, complication, crisis, climax, and resolution. And so here's an example of plot structure. This bottom axis would be the story's timeline, and the horizontal axis would be the interest or the action. So in the beginning, and you only need to be concerned about the yellow terms. In the beginning, the exposition introducing the character and setting, letting the reader know what's going on. Everything's hunky-dory right now. We're all happy. Nothing's wrong. But then there's the inciting incident, which starts the complication, is the first conflict or problem. And then the complication is the rising action. It's building, repeated building conflicts. They're just building on each other. Conflict gets worse and worse and worse. Remember, the conflict is something versus something else. Our character, our main character, our protagonist, wants something, is trying to get something or achieve something or get away from something, whatever, and somehow he's being blocked. Until it reaches the crisis and climax. And the crisis is that internal dilemma inside of the character. Is internal. The character is stuck between a rock and a hard place and has to make a decision, has to make a choice, and makes that decision. And the climax is all the action that results because of it. It's all the fallout of that decision. If you're in an action movie, it is the car chases, it's the, everybody getting killed, whatever. Okay? So, and then the story's over. The story ends when the conflict ends, because stories are all about conflict. And you have the resolution. So the crisis and climax occur at the end of the story. If it's a short story, it may be the last sentence or last couple of lines or paragraph. If it's a novel, it may be the last chapter. So the resolution is the tying of loose ends, the conflict, or the story is now over. And that's the following action happens between the climax and the resolution. Irony, this is our last literary element we're going to talk about, is when the writer's meaning is different. Often the opposite. Some people think it's always the opposite, but it's not always the opposite. It just has to be different from what is actually stated or actually happening. So verbal irony is our first kind of irony. There's 4 kinds. Verbal irony is the first. So the words are different. What is spoken or said is different or opposite from what is meant. And we talked about hyperbole. You're exaggerating. Understatement. Double entendre is when the words have 2 meanings. So, Sonny's Blues is a short story by James Baldwin. So Sonny, and this has a double entendre. Blues, Sonny, actually, the story, just to be very brief, Sonny plays the blues, the music. He's a blues musician. And so Sonny's Blues is saying Sonny plays the blues on the face of it. But he's also blue. So the blues represent his music, but also his mood. He's blue. He's feeling unhappy. Sunny means also sunny as in the disposition of being happy, like S-U-N-N-Y. But it's ironic because he's not happy. He's blue. But also sunny has another meaning because it's S-O-N-N-Y, as in Son of God. Christ was the Son of God, and Sonny he's a Christ figure in the story. So he sacrifices himself, and he's sort of a savior for other people. And then the other irony or double entendre here is that sunny and blue mean 2 completely different things. So James Baldwin puts kind of a quintuple irony in here, not just a double meaning. There's a quintuple meaning here, which is why he was such a good author. Now, the other 3 kinds of irony are dramatic, situational, and cosmic. Again, double meanings abound. Dramatic irony is when the audience or some characters know more than another character, so everything the character does has 2 meanings. The prime example of this is Oedipus in Oedipus Rex, or Oedipus the King, written by Sophocles in ancient Greece. And Oedipus has killed his father in addition to other things. But anyway, he is tasked with finding the killer, but he doesn't know he's killed his father. So he walks around saying, I'm going to find the killer, I'm going to kill the killer. He's talking about himself, he doesn't know it. The audience knows it. The reader of the play knows it, but Oedipus doesn't know it. So there's two meanings here. Every time he starts talking about that. Situational irony is when, has to do with the situation, has to do with the events. The events themselves have a double meaning. So sometimes we expect a situation to go a certain way and it doesn't. So that's two meanings, the way we expected it to go and the way it actually went. So we have a surprise ending, for example. That's situational irony. Or if there's any unexplained coincidence in the story, that's situational irony. And finally, we have cosmic irony. It's a type of situational irony because we expect good things to happen to good people. But in the story, we have good people and bad things are happening to them. So the universe or the cosmos itself is ironic. It's beyond their control. They can't help it. They don't deserve it. But these bad things are still happening. And it seems unfair and inappropriate to us. So that's cosmic irony. And so to sum up, point of view, forgot that. Okay. There's three persons in a story, author, narrator, and characters. The author writes the story. And the author is rarely seen in a story. They're just writing the story. It's the narrator and characters that we see. The narrator tells the story. The characters are in the story. They are whom the story is being told about. So, if the narrator is a character in the story, so the point of view concerns the narrator. Who is the narrator? Is the narrator a character in the story? Is the narrator talking about him or herself? Okay, so that's one type of point of view. That's first person. And the narrator could be in the story and also talking about other characters, but they're also talking about themselves. They're in the story. And then, but the narrator could be someone over and above talking about the story. And if so, how much knowledge do they have? How much do they know about the characters they're talking about? So, first person, of course, is the narrator is in the story. So the narrator uses the pronoun I, the first person pronoun, and tells us what the I, the person telling the story, the narrator, we know what he is or she is feeling and thinking. But we don't know what other people are, just like real life. Unless you're psychic, you can't tell me what other people are feeling and thinking. You can just tell me what you're feeling and thinking. But you can say what other people are doing and saying. Other kinds of first person or third person points of view are the third persons, and we have third person omniscient, limited, and dramatic or objective. So the third person narrative is never in the story, so we don't get the I pronoun unless in dialogue. All of these will never see I unless someone's speaking. If it's omniscient, this narrator is omniscient, or omni is all, scient is knowledge, so all-knowing. So this person can see into the minds of more characters than one. So they can see what at least two, possibly more characters are thinking or feeling. In addition to what everybody's saying and doing. Limited omniscient is you can only get into the mind of one character. So it's kind of like first person. You're in the mind of only one character. You can tell me what one character is thinking and feeling, but not any other ones. And then dramatic or objective is you can't get in the mind of any character. It's like watching a play. When you watch a play, you can't see what anyone is thinking or feeling. You can't understand it. It's not told to you. You can only see what people are doing and saying. And so that's why we have soliloquies. When Hamlet comes out in Shakespeare, Hamlet comes out and says, "To be or not to be, that is the question." The only way we know he's thinking that is because he says it out loud, right? So you can only get what people say out loud to know what they're thinking or feeling in objective, third person objective. So now we have the recap, analyze, don't summarize, look at the literary elements to find out how they reveal the theme, and our major literary elements, of course, conflict, characterization, symbolism, setting, plot structure, figurative language, point of view. All of these help us to understand the story and know what's going on.